He yelled at her in the middle of the street, a grown white cop towering over a 16-year-old black girl clutching her school books. People watched. No one stepped in. He accused her of loitering, called her disrespectful, and made her empty her bag on the hot pavement, all because of the color of her skin. But when Officer Clint Walker learned who she really was, the entire town went silent. What happens when power finally bullies the wrong child? If that kind of injustice makes your blood boil, hit like and share this story, because what comes next will shake you. I was there when it happened, high noon in Riverdale, heat shimmering off the asphalt. A shout cracked the quiet like a bat hitting glass. "Pick it up, all of it." Books were scattered at the curb. A slim black girl, later I learned her name was Aaliyah Brooks. 16 knelt to gather loose pages. The wind flipped a sheet that said justice in blue ink, another that said empathy. She reached for them like they mattered, like they were more than paper. A white police cruiser idled at the crosswalk. Officer Clint Walker stepped out and cast a shadow that swallowed the sun. He didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. The way he stood did most of the talking, chest forward, chin-locked hand, hovering too close to the gun on his hip. "You people never learn respect," he said. I felt something in me lurch. A man beside me muttered, "She's just a kid." Then he caught the angle of the officer's stance and shut his mouth. The air turned thin like the block had been vacuum sealed. The girl kept her voice level. "Sir, I didn't do anything wrong." "Then prove it." Walker opened his palm. She offered up her bag. Inside notebooks, a pencil pouch, a folded lunch, nothing else. He pawed through like he expected a confession to fall out. Nothing did. Only the soft clack of plastic against zipper teeth. Across the street, a boy shouted, "Leave her alone." His mother dragged him back by the elbow. The boy's voice shrank to a hiss, then to nothing. No one stepped forward. Not the man with the briefcase, not the couple holding iced coffees. We all just watched the way people watch a storm build over someone else's house. The girl's name, Aaliyah, kept her posture straight. Chin up, hands open. But I saw her throat work when she swallowed. I saw the tremor in her fingers when a page skittered away, and she chased it quick, apologetic, like she had done something terrible by letting the wind do what wind does. Walker leaned in until his shadow ran over her face. He didn't shout now. He tapped the heel of his hand against the butt of his gun. Subtle, loud. "Stay where you belong," he said. Something in the crowd shifted half a step back, half a step safer. I felt my own feet glued to the sidewalk. I hate admitting that. I really do. A woman a few yards away lifted her phone. Later I'd learned her name was Rachel Myers. She was trembling, but the camera stayed up. That takes a kind of courage most folks don't brag about. "Sir," Aaliyah tried again. "I'm just coming from the community center." Walker's eyes flicked to the bag again, dismissive. "Don't talk back." He nudged a notebook with his boot. The page with empathy smeared where a drop of water or sweat or a tear had landed. He watched the smear like it proved something. If he had known who she was, he might have swallowed that rage. He might have stepped back, told her to have a nice day, spun the whole thing into some routine stop he barely remembered by dinner. But he didn't know. And earlier that morning, before any of us knew her name, there was a different scene on a different street. I didn't see it with my eyes, but I can tell you what the town told me. What the video later showed Aaliyah at the community center, sleeves rolled, guiding a little boy's hand as he colored inside the lines for once. She laughed when he didn't. She said, "Color the sky green if you want. It's your sky." When she left, she bought a bottle of water for an old man and pushed back his change. "Keep the change, sir. That's a small thing, I know. But small things are how we measure people when nobody's filming." Back at the curb, the cruiser's engine idled steady like a metronome, keeping time for the whole block. Walker shifted his weight. He wasn't yelling. He didn't have to. He had the badge, the gun, the heat, the silence. Rachel held her phone a little higher. She didn't interfere. She documented. That's its own kind of intervention now. The man next to me cleared his throat and said, "Officer, she's got school books." It came out thin. Walker didn't even look over. Aaliyah gathered the last page and stood. Not defiant, just upright. There was a softness to her voice that made everything feel sharper. "I'm going home," she said. Walker stared, like home was an accusation. The boy across the street wriggled free of his mother's grip for a second and blurted, "She didn't do anything." The mother caught him again, pulled him close, whispered something urgent. He looked at the ground, angry in that helpless way only kids can be. The breeze picked up. The corner smelled like hot tar and spilled soda. A bus sighed at the light and moved on without letting anyone off, like even public transit didn't want a piece of this. "Empty the rest," Walker said. "There is no rest," Aaliyah answered. Her voice didn't shake now. That surprised me. It surprised him too. I saw at a half blink a recalculation. He didn't find anything because there was nothing to find. He found a lunch now, a little crushed. He found a pencil that had written justice in careful loops. He found every reason to back away and chose none of them. People will argue later about procedures and descriptions and threats that weren't there. But standing there, you don't think about policy. You feel the scale tilt and you know right this second it's wrong. Rachel kept filming. A car rolled by slower than it needed to. The driver's eyes flicked wide, then away. Heat pressed down harder, or maybe that was just the way fear thickens air. Walker took one last look inside the bag, then at Aaliyah, then at all of us who were pretending not to be involved while not missing a single second. He closed the bag without handing it back, held it for a heartbeat too long. Then he dropped it into her hands like a verdict. No apology, no explanation. Just the sound of zipper teeth catching the ripple of paper, settling the rumble of the cruiser when he turned away. She stood there a moment, hugging the bag to her chest like it could shield her from a glare, from a word from a world. I wish I'd said something then. I wish the man beside me had. I wish the mother had let her boy finish his sentence. We didn't. That's part of the story too. Later, this street would fill with microphones and signs and the heavy boots of people who finally decided to step forward. Later, we'd all learn why the officer should have swallowed his rage, why that girl's silence carried a name heavy enough to bend a room to its knees. But right then, in that bright and ordinary noon, Aaliyah turned to walk, and Walker watched her go, and the rest of us watched him watch her. She was just walking home, but prejudice doesn't need a reason. He didn't drive away. Officer Walker wanted more. He circled the cruiser like a man looking for something to break his voice sharp enough to slice through the heat. "You people always hide something," he said, each word soaked in suspicion more than duty. Aaliyah's voice was soft but steady. "Sir, I just came from the community center." Walker's reply hit like a slap. "Don't talk back." A horn honked somewhere down the block, but no one stopped. A delivery truck rolled by slow, the driver staring for half a second before turning away. Even the sound of the city seemed to fade, like the whole street was holding its breath, pretending not to see what was happening. A woman in a summer dress walked by with a cup of coffee. She slowed, frowned, maybe thought about saying something, then dropped her gaze and kept moving. That's the thing about fear, it spreads faster than courage. Walker slammed his palm against the hood of the cruiser. The metallic thud rang out a vibration that made Aaliyah's shoulders stiffen. Next time he warned, "Stay where you belong." Rachel Myers was still there a few yards away, her phone trembling in her hand. She didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't interfere. She just kept filming. Sometimes bravery doesn't come with noise. Sometimes it's a shaking hand that refuses to look away. Aaliyah took a slow breath. Her heart must have been pounding, but she straightened her back and met his eyes. "I'm not scared of you," she said quietly. The words hit harder than any scream. For a moment, Walker froze. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, too close, until his reflection faced hers in the cruiser's window. "You should be," he said low and deliberate. The space between them burned with tension. I remember thinking that anyone could have stepped in right then and changed everything. But we didn't. None of us did. A man beside me murmured, "She's just a kid." His voice cracked mid-sentence, swallowed by the sound of traffic. Nobody echoed him. Nobody dared. A couple across the street whispered, then looked away. The silence became a living thing, thick, heavy, crawling down everyone's throats. It wasn't just one officer shaming a girl. It was all of us letting it happen. Walker finally turned away, shaking his head like he'd won some kind of invisible argument. He walked back toward his cruiser boots, scraping the pavement. Aaliyah didn't move. She stood where she was, hands trembling but chin high. Rachel's camera caught it all, the humiliation, the courage the crowd pretending not to exist. Her breath came out shaky, but her frame never wavered. I remember thinking we'd all just witnessed something we'd want to forget. Something that would stay buried until someone decided to press upload. Because silence doesn't stay buried for long. Not when someone hits record. And as Walker climbed back into his cruiser, the engine rumbled loud and careless, like a warning no one had the guts to challenge. The crowd began to move again, pretending life had resumed its rhythm. But the air was still poisoned by what we'd let happen. Aaliyah bent down, picked up the last page that had fluttered away, the one that said justice. She brushed the dust off and tucked it back into her notebook. Then she walked away, her shadow stretched long under the sun, the kind of quiet that speaks louder than screams, following her all the way down the block. The man beside me sighed. The woman with the coffee turned her head just once, guilt flickering across her face before she disappeared into the crowd. Rachel lowered her phone slowly, her breath shaky. She whispered almost to herself, "They'll see this. Someone has to." Later the world would. But right then, as the heat shimmered above the street and that police cruiser drove off, one truth settled heavy on every heart that witnessed it. The silence was worse than the shouting. By nightfall, the video was everywhere. Rachel Myers uploaded it with a simple caption, "This is how a black child gets treated in 2025. No hashtags, no anger, just proof." Within hours, it spread like wildfire. On Facebook, a woman commented, "This could be my daughter." On Twitter, 1,000 others echoed it. Then 10,000 more. The clip hit the evening news before midnight. The internet didn't need context. It saw a white cop towering over a teenage girl with books in her hands, and that was enough. Some called it disrespect. Others called it the truth we already knew. But everyone called it something. Silence was no longer an option. Across town in the state capitol, Governor Samuel Brooks sat in his office, half listening to a policy briefing. A notification buzzed on his phone. His assistant whispered something about a video gone viral. He clicked it, and in less than 10 seconds, the world around him fell away. On the screen, his daughter, Aaliyah, standing small but unbroken under a badge and a shadow. The man yelling at her, the crowd watching, the sound of her voice calm, shaking brave. Samuel's hand trembled. The coffee mug slipped and shattered on the floor, a dark stain spreading across the marble. He didn't blink. He just stared, frozen, as if trying to make sense of a nightmare that was somehow real. Marilyn Brooks, his wife, stepped into the room. Her expression softened the moment she saw the screen. "Sam," she said quietly. He didn't look up. They humiliated her. Marilyn crossed the room, laid a hand on his shoulder. "If you react now," she said softly, "it'll look personal." He turned to her, then eyes sharp, wet alive. "It is personal, but not just for me." The room fell silent except for the hum of the monitor. He pressed replay. Again and again. Each time the same disbelief, the same sting. Somewhere between the third and fourth replay, the governor's jaw set in a way that told you this wasn't just about politics anymore. Across town, Aaliyah sat alone in her bedroom. The glow from her phone lit her face in fragments. Every few seconds, another notification popped up. Comments, messages, headlines. Brave girl, poor kid. Where were the adults? She scrolled for a while, then turned the screen face down. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. She stood, walked to the mirror. For a long moment, she just stared at herself. Not at her face, but at the exhaustion behind her eyes. She didn't see one girl. She saw hundreds, thousands who looked just like her. The ones who never got filmed. The ones the world never believed. She whispered to the reflection, "Why does it take proof to matter?" Then she turned off the light. The story didn't stop there. It was too late for that. By morning, the clip had reached every corner of the country. News anchors replayed it between weather reports and stock updates. Radio hosts argued whether Officer Walker had followed procedure. Talk shows brought on experts to debate tone, posture, and respect everything but the truth. One anchor said, "It's not just a video anymore. It's a mirror." Outside, reporters gathered at the steps of the Riverdale Police Department. Protest signs began to bloom like wildflowers, justice for Aaliyah. Accountability now. And somewhere in that noise, the name Clint Walker started trending, not as a badge number, but as a headline. Pressure built fast. The department issued a short statement calling it an ongoing review. But people weren't satisfied. They wanted something real. They wanted to know how a teenage girl's dignity could be stripped bare in broad daylight while everyone stood by. At the Capitol, Samuel sat in his office again, now surrounded by advisors. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. He looked out the window down at the crowd gathering below, signs raised high. Every face out there reminded him of Aaliyah's. He thought about what Marilyn had said, "It'll look personal." And she was right. It was personal. It always had been. That night, as the governor's mansion went dark, one light stayed on in Aaliyah's room. She sat by the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. She didn't want fame. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted a world that didn't need that video to care. But that's the thing about truth. Once it's out, it never stays quiet. And by morning, it wasn't just a girl's story anymore. It was a storm, a fight that had been waiting too long to begin. By the next morning, the Riverdale Police Department held a press conference. The chief stood behind a podium, his voice steady, rehearsed, and almost bored. Officer Clint Walker acted according to procedure, he said. "We are reviewing the incident internally." Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions that went unanswered. Behind him, Walker stood still in uniform, chin-up hands clasped like a man waiting to be congratulated. A journalist from Channel 7 called out Officer Walker, "Do you regret your actions?" He didn't flinch. "No, ma'am," he said. "She matched a suspect's description. I followed the law." That clip made it to every station in the state before noon. But later that evening, when the uniforms came off and the bar lights dimmed, the mask slipped. Walker sat at the counter of a small-town bar called the Rusty Rail. His tie hung loose around his neck. The bartender poured another whiskey without asking. The TV above them replayed the video, Aaliyah's small frame under his shadow. "They call me racist," he muttered with a crooked grin. "All I did was my job." A younger officer, barely past 30, sat a few stools away. He looked uncomfortable but curious. "You really think that was your job?" Sir Walker chuckled, eyes on the TV. "You'll learn soon enough. You hesitate out there, even once they'll eat you alive. I hesitated once before. Got a letter in my file for it." "You think I'm making that mistake again?" The younger cop didn't answer. He just stared at his drink like it had something worth saying. Walker took another sip, leaning back. "They don't know what it's like being the bad guy in every story. Everyone's got a camera. Everyone's waiting for you to blink wrong. You want to survive. You stop caring how it looks." The bartender turned up the volume. The TV was playing the news again, Aaliyah's video side by side with the press statement. Walker smirked. "See, I told you. They twist it all around. That girl, she knew what she was doing, wanted attention." No one replied. The bar went quiet except for the hum of neon and the faint sound of the TV anchor saying, "Public outrage continues to grow." Across town in the governor's mansion, the same broadcast was playing. Samuel Brooks sat on the couch, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the screen. The reporter's voice droned on. "Officer Walker maintains that he acted within policy." The footage cut to his quote again. "She matched a suspect's description." Samuel's hand tightened into a fist. The veins in his forearm stood out. "They humiliated her twice," he said quietly. "Once on that street and now on national television." Marilyn Brooks stood behind him, her hand resting on the back of the couch. She watched her husband weather crises before storms of politics, policy, and protest. But this one was different. This was bleeding into their living room. "Sam," she said softly, "you can't speak yet." He turned to her, eyes blazing. "How can I not?" "Because right now," she said, her voice calm, "anything you say will sound like anger. And anger burns fast. Truth has to last longer than that." He exhaled slowly, fighting the instinct to argue. She was right. She usually was. But the silence between them hurt worse than words. Finally, he said, "Then I'll trade power for truth." Marilyn met his gaze, steady but sad. "And what happens when they take both?" He didn't answer. He looked back at the screen. The sound was off now, but the image of Aaliyah standing on that street still filled the room. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Only the faint ticking of the mantel clock filled the space between breaths. In another home across town, Aaliyah sat cross-legged on her bed, watching the same news report. Her hands trembled as Walker's words echoed through the speakers. "She matched a suspect's description." Her chest tightened. She pressed pause and stared at the frozen frame, Walker's face, confident, smug, untouchable. Her mother knocked softly on the door. "Sweetheart, turn that off for a while." "I can't," Aaliyah whispered. "He's still talking." Downstairs, the governor's phone buzzed again. Aides, journalists, political advisors. They all wanted to know when he'd respond. But Samuel didn't answer. Not yet. He stood by the window looking out at the lights of Atlanta flickering against the night sky. Somewhere out there, his daughter's pain was turning into headlines, debates, hashtags. He pressed his hand against the glass, his reflection staring back, half father, half leader, both helpless. The thing about storms, he thought, isn't that they arrive suddenly. It's that you can hear them building long before they break. That night, the governor's mansion stayed awake long after the city slept. The glow of the TV painted the walls in shades of grief and resolve. Out there, Clint Walker finished his drink, slapped a 20 on the bar, and muttered to no one in particular, "They'll forget by next week." He didn't know that by next week his name would be carved into headlines, and that the man he'd humiliated's father was about to change the story forever. The press surrounded the Capitol steps before sunrise. Microphones flashing, cameras, voices calling out questions, all asking the same thing. "Governor Brooks, what do you have to say about the video?" Samuel stood in front of the doors, the state seal glinting faintly behind him. His jaw was set, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. He paused just long enough for every camera to focus, then said quietly, "No comment. For now." The words rippled through the crowd like a spark through dry grass. Reporters shouted follow-ups. He turned away. Inside, his aide, Daniel Harper, walked briskly beside him, holding a clipboard stacked with briefing notes. "Sir, you have the police union meeting in 20 minutes. The optics matter here. They're already accusing you of bias." Samuel didn't respond. Governor Daniel pressed, "If you take a stance too early, they'll call it a vendetta. If you wait too long, they'll call it weakness." Samuel stopped walking. The marble corridor swallowed the sound of his steps. He looked at Daniel, not angry, just tired. "Maybe," he said, "it's not about when I speak, but why." Daniel opened his mouth to reply, but the governor had already turned toward his office. Inside, the room was dim except for the flicker of the TV screen. The video was playing again, muted this time. For the 20th time that morning, Samuel watched the frame freeze on his daughter's face. The light from the monitor painted harsh lines across his features. Exhaustion, disbelief, a father's silent rage. His fingers trembled slightly as he gripped the remote. He pressed rewind. Play, rewind, play again. The same moment over and over. The same injustice replaying like a wound that refused to close. He exhaled sharply, rubbed his eyes, and leaned back in the chair. The weight of the office had never felt this heavy before. He'd faced hurricanes, scandals, legislative wars, but nothing that touched his blood like this. The aide knocked softly at the door. 10 minutes, sir." "I know," Samuel murmured. But he didn't move. Instead, his mind slipped backward to a memory 10 years old. It was a Sunday afternoon. Aaliyah was 6. They were driving home from church when a protest had spilled into the next street. Signs shouting confusion. She'd looked up from her booster seat and asked Daddy, "Do people hate us?" He had smiled gently, even though something inside him cracked a little. "Only the ones who haven't met us yet," he'd said. And then, because she was still frowning, he'd added, "That's why we keep standing tall, sweetheart, so they have the chance to." She'd nodded, small hands gripping the seatbelt, and whispered, "Then I'll stand tall too." Now, years later, he could still hear her voice, small, certain, and full of hope. He sighed. The TV played on mute, her image glowing softly in the dark. Across town, Aaliyah sat in her classroom, pretending to focus on the lesson. Her classmates whispered when she passed. One girl, smirking, said under her breath, "Governor's kid," with an attitude. Aaliyah turned to her, calmly, eyes steady. "At least I have one." The room went quiet. Even the teacher hesitated before resuming the lesson. At lunch, she sat alone. But she didn't look lonely, just thoughtful, distant, like someone holding back a storm. That evening, the rain began, slow at first, then steady against the window pane. Aaliyah stood in front of her mirror, shoulders tense, breathing slow. She lifted her chin, straightened her back, and whispered the words she'd learned from her father, "Stand tall in the storm." She practiced it again and again, until the reflection looking back wasn't a frightened girl, but someone stronger, someone ready. Down the hall, Samuel stood outside her door, listening without knocking. He didn't need to. He already knew what she was doing. And in that moment, pride and pain tangled inside him like one emotion. He went back to his study, the rain echoing against the roof, and looked out into the night. For all his power, the authority, the title, the influence, he felt small. But somewhere inside that smallness was something unbreakable. He whispered to the empty room, "She's teaching me how to be brave." The mansion was silent except for the rain. Aaliyah turned off the light. Samuel stayed awake, and the narrator's voice broke the stillness. He held power, but she held the reason to use it. They scheduled the press conference for late afternoon, the kind of hour when the sun angles in low and everything looks more honest than it feels. I found a spot along the back wall of the briefing room, fluorescent lights, stale coffee microphones lined like bayonets across a metal podium. Uniforms filled the front rows. Cameras hummed. Every breath sounded wired. Officer Clint Walker walked in from the side door, hat tucked under his arm. He looked rested, or practiced. The chief gave a few lines about policy and ongoing review, then stepped aside. Walker took the mic. "I followed the law," he said, voice flat-ironed, smooth. She matched the suspect's description. "I acted accordingly." Hands shot up. The first couple questions were easy lobs. Timelines, paperwork, training logs. He swatted them away without blinking. Then a reporter from the back cleared her throat and leaned into her mic. "Officer Walker," she asked, "would you say the same if it was your daughter on that curb?" The room sharpened. A few heads turned. Walker smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "I'd raise her better," he said. A small, shocked laugh broke somewhere near the door and died in the same second. You could feel people writing that line down in their heads, underlining it twice. My stomach went cold. Before the chief could intervene, the rear entrance clicked open. No security detail. No theatrics. Just a tall man in a dark suit stepping into the aisle as if he'd been invited. He wasn't announced. He didn't need to be. Governor Samuel Brooks. The air thickened. Even the cameras seemed to adjust their focus on their own. He walked the center aisle without hurry, hands at his sides, face unreadable. He stopped a pace short of the podium, turned not to the reporters but to Walker. "Officer Walker," he said, voice calm enough to cut. "Do you still believe you did nothing wrong?" Silence. Walker wet his lips. The confidence that looked so easy a minute ago slid an inch. I didn't know who she was," he said. Somewhere behind me, a pen stopped scratching. Somebody inhaled through their teeth. The chief shifted his weight, but the governor never took his eyes off Walker. "Play it," Samuel said. The chief hesitated. Then a sergeant in the corner tapped a keyboard. The lights dimmed a shade. On the screen behind the podium, bigger than life, the street flickered into view. The wind, the books, the page that said empathy, the officer's shadow. "Pick it up, all of it." The sound came through the cheap speakers with a tinny bite, and it was somehow worse, like that crude inescapable. People watched themselves watching. The room went still in the way rooms go still at funerals and in courtrooms and at hospital bedsides where machines do the talking. Aaliyah's voice small and steady. "Sir, I didn't do anything wrong." Then the line we all remembered, the one that crawled under the skin. "You people never learned respect." When the clip ended, no one moved. You could hear the cooling fan inside the projector. A camera operator sniffed once and tried to make it sound like a cough. The governor spoke to the screen first, then to the man beneath it. "That girl," he said, slow, careful, each word set down like a stone, "is my daughter." He let it land. Walker's mouth opened, then shut. The chief stared at the floor. Samuel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. But you didn't need to know who she was. He continued to treat her like a human being. Something in the room broke quietly. A reporter near the center dropped her gaze. Another reached for a tissue, like she was tired of pretending it was just the air conditioning. In the side aisle, Marilyn Brooks had appeared, no spotlight, just presence. She watched her husband with eyes that shone, not from performance, but from the kind of pride that hurts. Walker tried to stand taller the way men do when they're shrinking. He looked from the governor to the camera, to the chief, back to the governor, hunting for a line that would save him. "Governor, he started. Samuel shook his head once, small and final. "No," he said. "Not today." A reporter found her voice. "Governor Brooks," she asked, "are you making a formal accusation?" "I'm stating a simple truth," he said. "We all saw it." Another voice pushed forward. "Sir, will you pursue charges?" Samuel's eyes did not leave Walker's. "The law will take the path it must," he said. "But sometimes the shortest path to justice is not through a courtroom." A murmur rolled through the rows, a mix of confusion and curiosity. He let it pass. He turned slightly, facing not just Walker now, but the assembled gaze of the state. "This isn't about titles," he said. "It isn't about me. It's about what we expect from people we give power to and what we owe to the children we ask to trust that power." He paused there, letting the sentence breathe, letting it find the places in the room that were ready to hold it. Walker's shoulders slumped a fraction. The badge on his chest looked heavier than it had at the door. A photographer near the front stepped back to catch the screen, and the man in the same framed the image every morning show would run tomorrow. The chief cleared his throat like he wanted the moment back. It was too late for that. Samuel drew in a breath and set the final line down where nobody could miss it. "The law will judge your actions," he said, still level, still stone. "Conscience will judge you longer." No one clapped. No one dared. The sentence didn't invite applause. It asked for silence, and it got it. The governor turned, nodded once to the chief without waiting for a reply, and walked the same aisle he'd entered, still with no entourage, no flourish, just gravity. Marilyn stepped aside to let him pass, and fell in behind him, hand brushing his sleeve for a heartbeat enough. Walker watched him go, lips pressed, tight color, drained the bravado from the bar, and the morning news burned off under a different kind of heat. Questions ricocheted in the vacuum he left. A reporter called for comment. Another shouted after the chief. The projector fan wound down, leaving the room to its own noise. I stayed where I was for a breath longer, feeling the balance tip first in my chest, then in the air itself. In 7 minutes, a sentence had moved a mountain. A name had become a mirror, and a room full of people who thought they were here for answers had been given something heavier. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the building sounded different. Not louder, clearer, like everyone had remembered what their own voice was for. Inside, Walker stood smaller than his uniform, the screen behind him frozen on the last frame, a girl with school books and a wind that would not stop telling the truth. News doesn't spread anymore. It detonates. By morning, every station in America had replayed the governor's words. The clip of Samuel Brooks standing before that podium. "You didn't need to know who she was. To treat her like a human being" became the sentence of the week. Officer Walker was suspended before lunch. His badge and gun turned in quietly, but the noise outside never stopped. Online, the world split in half. Half called him a disgrace. The other half called him a scapegoat. And in between those two sides, a 16-year-old girl was trying to find her own voice. At the Brooks home, cameras still lined the street, reporters hoping for another statement. But inside the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when a family knows every word matters. Samuel sat by the window, watching the flashes of light through the blinds. In the next room, Aaliyah stood in front of her mirror, holding a stack of notes. She took a deep breath. Then she began to speak. Her voice trembled at first, words catching, like they were afraid to come out. She stopped, rewound, the sentence started again. "I'm not a symbol," she whispered to her reflection. "I'm just a person who didn't want to be treated like less." She tried again, this time louder. Her cadence found shape, her tone steadier. Every stumble became smaller than the one before. Samuel stood in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe, unseen. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Behind him, Marilyn approached softly, her presence calm as ever. She slipped her hand into his. "She's ready," she said. He exhaled. "I'm not sure I am." Marilyn smiled faintly. "Then that's how you know it's her turn." Inside the room, Aaliyah adjusted her shoulders, looked herself straight in the eye, and said it again, this time, like she meant every syllable. "They need to see me, not my father." It wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. You could hear it in her tone, the certainty of someone who finally understood that courage wasn't about shouting louder, but about standing when the whole world expects you to shrink. Downstairs, Samuel turned away from the door. He looked older that evening, but not weaker, just full of a kind of quiet awe. Marilyn whispered, "You taught her how to stand tall." He shook his head. "No," he said softly. "She taught herself how to stay standing." Outside, the news kept roaring, anchors, pundits, protest signs, hashtags. But inside that house, everything slowed down. The storm didn't feel so big anymore. That night, I remember thinking the girl they tried to silence was learning to teach the state to listen. She didn't need a podium. She didn't need the title her father carried. All she needed was her truth, steady practiced and unstoppable. And as she read her final line to the mirror, her voice no longer wavered. It rang through the quiet house like something sacred. Not anger, not defiance, just the sound of someone becoming who she was meant to be. The auditorium was full long before the doors closed. Cameras lined the aisles, reporters elbow to elbow, their whispers mixing with the low hum of anticipation. At the center, beneath the state flag, in the heavy seal of Georgia, stood Governor Samuel Brooks, tall, composed, but quieter than usual. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and scanned the crowd. For a moment, the only sound was the shuffle of papers and the click of lenses. Then he said simply, "I won't be speaking today." A ripple went through the room. Confusion, curiosity. Then movement. Aaliyah Brooks, stepping from behind the curtain. 16 years old, small in frame, but carrying a presence that reached the back wall. She walked up beside her father, took a steadying breath, and looked out at hundreds of faces, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all waiting. She gripped the podium with both hands. "I didn't come here to make anyone small," she said, her voice clear but soft. "I came here so you could see me the way my dad does." A hush fell over the crowd. Even the cameras seemed to slow their blinking. She glanced at her father once, then back at the sea of people. "You didn't just hurt me?" She continued, her tone trembling, then steadying again. "You hurt every girl who looks like me. Every girl who's told to lower her voice, to keep her hands visible, to smile so no one feels afraid of her." There was a pause, a small, sacred silence that seemed to stretch forever. Then she took a deeper breath. "But I forgive you." The words caught everyone off guard. "I forgive you," she repeated, looking directly into one of the cameras, "because hate can't heal anything. And I don't want to carry what you gave me." Someone in the audience gasped. Someone else wiped their eyes. In the third row, Officer Clint Walker sat stiff in his seat, wearing a plain suit stripped of his badge, his hands clenched together. When the camera found him, he didn't look away. His lips trembled. A tear, quick embarrassed, slipped down his cheek. From where I stood at the back, I saw people turn their heads, recognizing him. A whisper rippled through the rows. "That's him. That's the cop who humiliated her." Aaliyah didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I'm not standing here because I'm brave," she said. "I'm standing here because I don't want to be afraid anymore. And because I still believe that people can change if they want to." Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, and somehow that made it stronger. For a moment, she glanced at the floor, took one long breath, then smiled faintly, just enough to light the space around her. "My dad told me once that power means nothing if it can't protect what's right. But I think maybe it also means knowing when to hand the microphone to someone else." The crowd fell completely silent. Some were crying, some were just still. Behind her, Samuel Brooks stepped forward quietly and placed a hand on her shoulder. His voice carried the kind of pride that doesn't need volume. "You just did what leaders do," he said. The flash of cameras returned, brighter now, but softer somehow, less invasive. The kind of light that feels like witness, not spectacle. Walker stood up from his seat. He didn't say anything. He just lowered his head and clapped once, hesitant at first, then again. Others followed. In seconds, the whole auditorium joined in. It wasn't applause for a speech. It was something deeper, a collective exhale, a quiet surrender to grace. Aaliyah stepped back from the podium. Her father turned toward her, and for the first time since that terrible afternoon, they both smiled. Not the smile of victory, but of peace, of surviving the storm together. As they walked off the stage, hand in hand, the camera stayed rolling, trying to catch one last image of what forgiveness looked like. And I remember thinking, as the crowd rose to its feet, that justice didn't roar that day. It whispered, and the world listened. The verdict came quietly, no sirens, no gavel slam, no crowd waiting for fireworks. The district attorney's office announced it at noon. No criminal charges will be filed against Officer Clint Walker. For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for anger to ignite. But what followed wasn't rage. It was confusion. Some called it mercy. Others called it betrayal. Everyone called it complicated. Instead of prison time, Walker was ordered to complete a new state program, one born from reform, not retribution. It was called Reform by Experience. The rule was simple: face those you've hurt, listen to their stories, serve the community you once harmed. The press wanted a statement from the governor. Samuel Brooks stepped to the podium, no notes in his hand this time. Justice without humanity isn't justice, he said evenly. It's revenge. And revenge never builds anything worth keeping. No one clapped. They just listened the same way you listen when you're not sure if you agree, but you know the man speaking believes every word. That night, far from the cameras, Walker sat alone in his small apartment. The television flickered faint blue across his face. The same video played again. Aaliyah's voice, calm, scared, still echoing through time. "Sir, I didn't do anything wrong." He didn't hit pause this time. He let it play all the way through, every second of it, the shouting, the crowd, the silence that followed. When it ended, he sat there for a long while, his eyes red, his throat tight. From the hallway came a small voice. "Daddy?" It was his daughter, 8 years old, pajamas, too big hair, messy from sleep. She rubbed her eyes and looked at him. "Why did you do that to her?" He blinked hard. The question landed like a stone in the chest. He stopped to try it again. His voice cracked. "Because I forgot she was someone's daughter too." The child didn't say anything. She just came closer and rested her head against his arm. He swallowed, staring at the paused frame, Aaliyah's face frozen mid-blink. The next morning, he walked into the Reform by Experience Center wearing plain clothes and a silence that followed him like a shadow. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. Chairs arranged in a circle, each labeled with a name tag. He sat in the last row, head low, hands folded tight. One by one, people spoke. Mothers of boys who'd been stopped for fitting a description. Men who'd served time for crimes they never committed. A teenager who said she still flinched when she saw a police cruiser. Walker listened, at first with his jaw locked, then with his eyes lowered. Somewhere in the middle of a woman's story about her brother being slammed to the ground, for no reason, he wiped his eyes, pretending it was just dust. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated. His voice came out rough, scraped raw. "I was wrong," he said. "Not just that day. For a long time before that. I thought respect was something you forced out of people. But now I know. I only ever scared them into silence." He paused, fingers shaking slightly. "I want to unlearn everything that made me this way." The room stayed still. No applause, no comfort, just understanding. The kind that weighs more than words. In the back row sat Aaliyah, unnoticed at first, hood up, quiet, listening. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. When Walker finally looked up, their eyes met across the room. She gave a small nod, no anger, no pride. Just peace. And for the first time since that afternoon on Riverdale Street, Clint Walker lowered his head, not in shame, but in surrender to truth, to empathy, to something human again. Outside, the sky was breaking open with the first rain of spring. He walked out slowly, feeling every drop like a kind of baptism. I remember watching him go, his shoulders lighter than they'd been in months. And as the door closed behind him, I thought of something Aaliyah once said. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just stops it from owning you." Maybe that's what happened there, two people on opposite sides of a wound, deciding it didn't have to bleed forever. Because some prisons have no walls, only memories that won't let you sleep. A year passed. Spring came early that year, soft, light, open skies, and the kind of calm that feels like an apology from the world itself. The state's Reform by Experience program had grown beyond anyone's imagination. What began as a quiet experiment in accountability was now a national model studied in universities and replicated in cities that once swore such change was impossible. And today they were all gathered, again press, families, students, leaders, to celebrate the anniversary of the movement born from a single street, a single voice, a single act of courage. The auditorium was smaller this time, less grand but warmer somehow. There were no flashing lights, no crowd pushing for a headline, just people who had learned the hard way what listening really meant. At the front of the stage, Aaliyah Brooks stood behind the same podium her father once used. She didn't look nervous. She looked centered. The kind of calm that comes after weathering a storm and realizing you're still standing. When she spoke, her voice carried not power but grace. Justice isn't loud, she said. It doesn't always roar or demand to be seen. It lives quietly in the choices we make when no one's watching. The room went still. You could feel the weight of her words settle into the air. She glanced toward the front row, her parents sitting side by side. Governor Samuel Brooks had stepped down months earlier, choosing time with his family over another term. He looked older but lighter. Beside him, Marilyn smiled with a calm, knowing pride that only mothers understand. Aaliyah continued, "We all want change to sound like thunder, but sometimes it sounds like forgiveness, like someone saying, 'I see you. I was wrong.' That's where healing begins." Her voice caught for just a second, but she didn't hide it. She let the pause breathe, and that silence was stronger than any applause could have been. Outside in a park not far from the Capitol, a man jogged alongside a group of kids. Officer Clint Walker, no longer an officer, just Mr. Walker, now wore a faded gray hoodie and a whistle around his neck. He called out encouragements as the children ran laughing through the morning air. When one of them tripped and fell, he was the first to reach out a hand, helping the boy up. "You're fine," he said softly. "Just breathe. Try again." The boy nodded, smiled, and ran on. Walker watched him go, then turned toward the sound of church bells in the distance. He smiled small, tired but real. Redemption rarely announces itself. It just shows up one act of kindness at a time. At the end of the run, a little girl ran back to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Thanks, Coach." He froze for half a heartbeat, then knelt and hugged her back. That moment wasn't news. It didn't go viral. It didn't need to. Back inside the auditorium, Rachel Myers sat in the audience, hands clasped tight in her lap. She had been the one who recorded that first video, a stranger with a phone and a heartbeat too loud to stay silent. Now watching Aaliyah speak, tears filled her eyes. She whispered to the woman next to her, "That's the girl from my video." And for a brief shining second, pride and awe flickered in her face because she knew what that sentence truly meant now. Aaliyah smiled, finishing her speech, not with triumph, but with truth. "I used to think justice lived in courtrooms," she said. "But I've learned it lives in people, in the way we decide to treat each other after the shouting stops." She stepped back from the podium. The crowd rose not in thunder, but in unity, a standing silence before the applause began. Down in the front row, Samuel reached for Marilyn's hand. Their fingers intertwined, wordless gratitude, quiet pride. The kind that says, "We made it through." Aaliyah looked out at them, eyes shining, and for a moment she wasn't the governor's daughter or a symbol or a headline. She was just a girl who had found her voice and used it well. The cameras panned slowly across the room, over faces changed by what they'd seen, what they'd learned. And the narrator's voice came in soft, almost a whisper. She was just a girl that day. But in her silence, the whole world finally heard itself. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because sometimes justice doesn't shout. It lingers in hearts that finally understand what it means to listen. Sometimes justice doesn't come with noise or punishment. It comes through courage, forgiveness, and the will to do better. This story wasn't just about a mistake or a headline. It was about growth, about listening when it's hardest to hear, and finding humanity even when anger feels easier. If this story touched you, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who still believes that kindness can change things. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories, where every story reminds us that empathy is strength and truth always finds its voice. Your support means the world to us. It's what keeps the Mr. Mac's Stories team creating the kind of stories that move hearts, spark reflection, and remind the world that justice, real justice, begins with understanding.